Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Jacqueline Rosemary Salguero Huaman will defend the academic thesis Making Trade Work for Gender Equality, Essays on the Trade and Gender Nexus in Developing Countries. May I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Prorector, supervisors, members of the Corona, family, friends, everyone joining online, good afternoon. Buenas tardes. In the next 15 minutes, I will provide a concise overview and share the key findings of my thesis, Making Trade Work for Gender Equality, Essays on the Trade and Gender Nexus in Developing Countries. Gender equality is not only a human right, it is also key for sustainable development, given the key economic role that women play. Women own a large share of micro and small companies, and these companies are the backbone of any society. These companies that are owned by women tend to employ more women and also contribute largely to the service sector, fostering economic diversification. International trade is key for our economy. It has transformed economies, linking continents, countries, communities through trade flows. Nearly all countries have signed at least one trade agreement. However, the benefits of trades are not uniformly distributed, particularly when it comes to women and men. The discourse about trade and development has been evolving, and now acknowledge trade as a potential tool for gender equality and women's economic empowerment. This shift is marked by some milestones. For example, the inclusion of gender provisions in trade agreements and the 2017 World Trade Organization Declaration on Gender Equality and Women's Economic Empowerment. It is within this evolving landscape that my thesis aims to answer a crucial question. How does trade and trade liberalization impact gender equality and women's economic empowerment in trade? And this is key for several reasons. Standard trade theories often overlook gender differences, assuming a level playing field. And while policies, including trade policies, are designed to or construct to be universally accessible, reality tells us a different story. According to the World Bank, Women, Business and the Law, only 12 out of 190 countries offer a legal equality, which means that about 2.4 billion women are deprived from equal economic opportunities. This discrepancy between unequal economic opportunities and can translate or might translate into unequal outcomes for women in trade. It is therefore a misconception to assume that women and men play equal roles in trade as workers, consumers, firm owners, managers, because women do not have the same conditions and access to resources compared to men. This also implies that trade-specific policies are not the only one to blame. There may be other policies that can also determine whether women can benefit or not from trade. So thanks to feminist scholars, the relevance of these topics have been widely recognized. Yet key questions about, for example, what should be addressed remain. This is exactly what motivated me to study this topic. So my thesis is divided into 6 chapters. Chapter 1 and 6 look into introduction and conclusions, and Chapter 2 explore the macro landscape and identify knowledge gap. Chapter 3 looks or evaluates the gender sensitivity of trade and trade-related policies at the meso level by looking at institutions. The next 2 chapters delve into the micro level and areas that are yet less studied. For example, Chapter 4 explored the role of large-scale agricultural investments in fostering gender equality, and Chapter 5 explored the relationship between gender diversity in the workforce and firm performance in trading firms, looking specifically at the case of Vietnam. So Chapter 2 explores who gains more as trade in a country liberalized, men or women. So to answer this question, I started with a critical literature review to construct a conceptual framework and formulate 8 hypotheses around or revolve around the role of women as workers, firm owners, managers, and consumers. I then use Scopus database with trade and gender as keywords and found 852 unique articles. After applying an inclusion and exclusion criteria, 84 articles were kept for in-depth analysis. Then I used manual coding and lexical analysis to identify key themes and patterns within these 84 articles that I then analyzed using a narrative synthesis. The beauty of the narrative synthesis is that it helps you to understand what works, what doesn't work, for who, when. And this allowed me to identify pathways, positive, negative, or neutral, that affect women, through which trade can affect women. So the findings suggest that most literature focus around the role of women as workers, revealing gaps regarding the role as entrepreneurs and consumers. But even in the role of women as workers, we can see that most of the literature focus at the macro-level trade gains. So what does that mean? The changes in export and imports might affect women's employment, gender wage gap, and working conditions. Despite the limited evidence, pathways were also observed at different levels, for example, industry level, firm level, household and community level, and policy level. So positive pathways were observed through wage premiums, MSME practices fostering gender equality, greater economic independence for women, gender-sensitive policies, while negative pathways were observed through structural changes, technology upgrading, resources and constraints, and socioeconomic norms. It was also observed that trade gains might not be sustained over time and changes across countries and industries. Chapter 3 investigates to what extent have countries incorporated gender considerations into trade policies, strategies, and practices. So to do this, a conceptual framework was developed from an institutional perspective. So what does that mean? First, that it takes into account from policy design to policy implementation, as well as the policy capacity of the policymaker. Then identifies potential enablers or factors that inhibit women's participation in trade. And then, based on that, I was able to distill some policy dimensions. This includes trade policy, legal and regulatory framework, business environment, access to skill, access to finance, work, and society. So to apply this framework, a semi-structured questionnaire was developed that was administered to over 400 government officials across 25 countries between 2019 and 2020. With this data, 83 indicators were developed, each indicator with a score from 0 to 1. I then analyzed this data set using a dual method approach. So a scoreboard index was constructed in each one of these policy dimensions, and then all of them were aggregated into a single indicator, or called also a composite index. And then also I used clustering analysis to be able to reveal some potential patterns and groupings within this data set. So the results reveal a varied landscape. While the average score surpassed 0.5 for each country, meaning a moderate success of gender mainstreaming, no country was able to achieve a score of 1 across all these 6 dimensions. So as displayed on the right side of this slide, the clustering analysis that you can see there allow me to group countries according to their performance, as low, medium, and high performance. And the majority of countries, which are the ones in red, which are 13, fell into this low performer category, which also suggests us that there are many countries that actually need a lot of improvement. This analysis also highlighted the shortfall in the trade policy pillar compared to the strong performance in the legal and regulatory framework pillar. And this discrepancy emphasizes the gap between policy implementation and policy design. So Chapter 4 explored how do women participate in large-scale foreign investment in agriculture in developing countries, and how do these investments directly or indirectly affect the economic and social position of employed women workers. This is relevant because trade is not only about export and import and tariffs. It also relates to how multinationals impact host countries. FDI in agriculture have increased over decades and remains a critical sector for investment, particularly in developing countries. So far, the assumption has been that because investors come to areas where not much existed before, the outcomes should be positive. But these potential transmission channels, even if positive, have not yet been explored. So I analyzed 8 large-scale agricultural investments across 4 countries, focusing on crops such as rice, flour, spices, sugar, tea, and coffee. I also collected data using a semi-structured questionnaire, and in total, 113 workers were interviewed, and also different stakeholders such as local government and investors. So the chapter suggests that women can or encounter both opportunities and challenges, and there are no significant differences across investments, countries, and crops cultivated. So on the positive side, the investments have created economic opportunities for women, improving their financial autonomy and access to resources. Gender-specific advantages such as enhanced household decision-making power and access to infrastructure. Moreover, investments have facilitated access to infrastructure and social goods, contributing to personal development, social recognition, and improved health, nutrition, and education outcomes for women's children. However, challenges persist, such as low-paid jobs, unstable jobs, gender wage gap, and sexual harassment. Gender-specific negatives include underrepresentation in higher value-added tasks, limited contracts available, and negative spillover highlight the risk of social exclusion, the increased vulnerability to marginalization, and reduced access to resources. The last chapter, chapter 5, explored how do gender diversity levels in the workforce associate with firm performance in Vietnam, and are there differences between firms in the manufacturing and service industries. It draws upon 3 theories. The first, a resource-based theory, suggesting that diversity enhances firm performance by broadening skills and perspectives within firms. In contrast, the social identity theory, that you can see in the middle, suggests that in-group and out-group dynamics might cause potential performance drawbacks. So by combining these 2 theories, the organizational behavioral theory proposed by Counter suggests an inverted U-shaped relationship, in which the level of diversity, whether uniform, moderate, or high, play an important role in maximizing the benefits of diversity. And this inquiry leads to 2 hypotheses that are explained in my thesis. The first one related to the relationship, whether it's inverted or not. The second related to the differences between manufacturing and service industries. So I use for this chapter the Vietnam Enterprise Service data from 2019 that encompasses 73,934 registered exporters and importers across various industries, and includes gender variables such as the number of female workers. Vietnam makes an interesting case study because of their high level of integration into global markets, strong gender equality policies, and the data availability. For this study, I used the ordinary least square regression, and firm performance was measured using net turnover and labor productivity, while gender diversity was measured using the Blow Index and the female share. The slide also lists other explanatory variables that were used in this study. So the findings suggest that in general, all firms follow an inverted U-shaped relationship, aligning with Cantor's theory, and that moderate levels of diversity, which ranges from 20 to 40% of female representation, optimizes firm performance, while extremes in either direction might hinder it. So as displayed on the interaction plots on the right side, the relationship seems to vary between manufacturing and service industry, and for manufacturing industries, we are likely to observe an inverted U-shaped relationship, and for services firms, we are likely to observe a positive trend. So to conclude, the systematic review reveals that existing research across different countries and industries is insufficient and limited, even when we talk about the role of women as workers. The Triad Gender Scoreboard Index suggests that although some countries are making progress, there is still a lot of gaps in implementation. The mixed effects of large-scale agricultural investments on gender equality challenges the positive outcomes expected. The insights from the relationship between gender diversity in the workforce and firm performance underscore, first of all, the complexity of studying this issue, and also suggest that perhaps optimal levels of gender diversity might vary by diversity level and industry. So based on these findings, this thesis proposes some recommendations. First, it suggests strengthening gender disaggregated data to continue to increase awareness on this triad gender nexus in other areas, as well as to provide evidence to inform policy design and policy implementation. As is known and said, what gets measured gets done. advocating for gender considerations in foreign agricultural investment to mitigate any potential negative impacts. Additionally, it is important to work and raise awareness on the business case for gender diversity within exporting and importing firms that have been left aside so far. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I would like to give the floor back to the highly esteemed prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The Jury Committee consists of 5 members, 3 of which are present. 2 will participate for the opposition online. The first member of the opposition and will thus open the opposition will be Professor Dr. Mark Sanders, who was the chair of the assessment committee and who is professor of international economics at this university. The floor goes to Professor Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Jacqueline, let me start by congratulating you on an impressive and well-written thesis. I've read your work with great pleasure, and it's clear from the pages that you care deeply for the subject in this study, and it's also clear from your presentation here. You started with the observation that trade has been liberalized in the past decades, raises an important question: has it benefited men and women equally? In theory, the balance can go either way, and you've done quite a lot of work in trying to explore this. You have excellently summarized your work, so I'm not going to repeat that here. I was particularly impressed with the chapter where you collected data yourself in the field from over 100 policymakers in 25 countries and interviewed people in what I can imagine are challenging conditions in the field in developing countries. So my congratulations on that. I wanted to start by challenging you a little bit on the work you present in Chapter 5. It's closer to my own field, I guess. The chapter zooms in on exporting and importing firms in Vietnam, and you introduce the Blau Index and the share of female employment in these firms. And you want to test 2 hypotheses that you have introduced briefly on the relationship between gender diversity and firm performance. And you estimate this in a relatively straightforward way. I would say that is always the first step, an OLS regression in a cross-section of firms. But that also raises an immediate question to any economist reading it about the causal mechanisms behind the relationships that you've estimated. So you show that in the data, indeed, you find, and you showed us the figures, you find this inverse relationship, but that is a correlation. There seems to be a pattern in the data that confirms or does not belie, let's put it that way, your hypotheses. But what can you tell us about causality? What can you tell us about whether it is gender balance and moderate gender diversity, as you call it, causing firm performance, or is there also a possibility that the firm performance feeds back into the composition of the employment, particularly in the case of Vietnam, where we have a lot of firms active in sectors like textiles, where your firm performance depends on your costs of production, and maybe female workers are simply a way to cut costs, and it has very little to do with the causal mechanisms that you proposed for supporting your hypotheses, deriving your hypotheses. Could you reflect on the causal mechanisms and what your data and analyses have taught you about that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this interesting and insightful question, and also thanks a lot for the best wishes. So let me maybe just answering your question, let me just go one step back and saying, why did I have selected this model? As you clearly stated, the data that I was able to obtain to be able to carry out this research was cross-sectional. And the government, in this case of Vietnam, does not collect this data. So every year they collect different type of information. So it was only in 2018 that they collected data on exporters and importers. given the relevance of this topic and that no one actually, so far to my knowledge, have looked into this relationship, as you also clearly stated, this is a first step. So I have reflected as well on, of course, the limitations of looking at the cross-sectional due to potential reverse causality, as you have also stated. But also, I would like to highlight something also that was interesting and how also I wanted to, or how actually I was trying to explain it on my thesis, in my thesis. So we know that, and also some theories has also suggested us that exporters and importers are different to non-exporters. And we know that there are some theories, for instance, Millets and also Wagner, who have carried out some research, and that says that usually exporters tend to self-select themselves into the market. So because they are the most productive, the one that perform best on the market, it's natural for them to get into these exporting activities or also importing activities. So therefore, when I selected these countries, to some extent, I was able to mitigate some kind of omitted variables because I was already looking at a subset of companies that are already performing well or that are considered to performing well. The reverse causality, of course, comes from the fact that there is, of course, we can argue that companies that are performing well might also be more likely to hire more female women because of reputational issues, because they have more money or more resources to be able to hire women and train them as well. So by just looking into this subset, of course, I'm just looking into companies that already are considered to performing well. So I'm not including those non-exporters. Of course, the OLS in itself has some limitations, and the model that I have selected, and I have also reflected on other models that can be used, for example, instrumental variables. But during my research, I was not able to find any instrument that could be suited. Reflecting afterwards, I have been thinking on what instruments can be used. And for instance, I have been looking into the using the supply that is available in each region, for example, to be able to see, so it's not something that will be linked to firm performance, but to the ability of women within that region. But that information was not available yet. So it's a labor statistics that is not yet available, also demographic information that is not yet available, but I was looking into that direction also moving forward. That could be an instrumental variable that can be used, and of course panel data will help a lot, but in the case of Vietnam, this information was only collected once.
I obviously understand and I'm sympathetic to the problem of data availability. You have to make the best of what you have. I find it a little bit less convincing that you could not find data on the, you call it the availability of women at the regional level in Vietnam. I think that data is available and can be found. If not the employment or the labor supply, then at least the composition of the population is relatively basic information. But I haven't looked, so I'll take your word for it that you have. What I find less convincing in your answer is when you say, okay, I've looked at firms that are already self-selected into exporting, importing, and being better performers. Generally in statistical research and in academic research in general, if you want to learn about some group, women or exporting firms, or you need to contrast that with the non whatever the group is you're interested in, so the non-women or the non-exporting firms. So by studying a sample that is biased, I do not think you solve the problem or make the problem less. Actually, this relationship between the female share or the Blau index and the productivity and performance may be caused by the same variables that cause the selection into the sample that you're looking at, and then your results reflect that rather than the causal mechanism. So this is why I'm pushing you a little bit on this topic. But if I may follow up just briefly with a follow-up question, because I was looking at tables 19 and 20, and I was a bit confused in table 19. You have the predicted coefficients, that's always nice. But turnover and productivity, they have a negative and significant coefficient on the firms that are exporting only. And I was wondering about, it's just a control variable, but it's something that you should think about. So I'm sure you thought about it, and I would like to hear your thoughts about what might explain that rather, at least to me, odd result that the exporting firms would on average be less productive than the non-exporting firms.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for challenging me as well and for this very interesting question. So on the results, indeed, also as I was presenting in my thesis, some of the results were not according to what we consider to be according to the literature, so were a little bit different to what we see usually. But also how the variable was constructed, perhaps I can give you a little bit more explanation in this regard. So the exporter only also includes companies that export and import. So they only export but not import, but also those companies that are exporting and importing. While the importer only will be, of course, the opposite. So it's true that it was somehow not according to the literature what I found, it was primarily the importers who I recall from my paper were actually the ones who were performing better than the exporters. And to some extent, I was trying to reflect and trying to look for information that could help me to understand why. And so I look into Wagner and other authors as well. As you rightly pointed out, so exporters being not as good as exporters and importing being better than exporters. So one of the potential reasons also was regarding the landscape of Vietnam. So in Vietnam, what you have is a very dynamic sector in terms of electronics, of light electronics, and they depend a lot on imports. So they import different inputs from different countries, from the region, and then they export, of course, to other countries. So therefore, perhaps these importers are more integrated into value chains compared to only exporters. So I found that perhaps that could be, or give us some light of why we find that in terms of those results. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Judith Vesahai, who was also a member of the assessment committee and who is senior program officer head of the Women and Trade program. So the floor goes to Dr. Vesahai, hopefully online. Yes, she's online now. Wonderful.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I would like to start to congratulate Jacqueline Salguero for her PhD thesis. I found it extremely interesting and very comprehensive. You have covered many interesting topics that are really relevant for gender equality in terms of the sectoral analysis as well as the policy analysis. I have two very big questions. So the first one is in relation to how innovative the research is. As you know, lately, in the last few years, there's been a lot of research on open gender and type of new publications. So I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little more on what does this research brings to the table. What's new about the research in terms of the data, the inequality, and so forth. And then what you see for the future. Where are the key research gaps going forward? Thank you.
Thank you, esteemed opposition member. I think I was able to hear perhaps half of the question because of the audio issues, but if I understood correctly, you are asking me of what, or you want to know what's next and how this information can be really used, I guess, in the research of trade and gender moving forward. Am I correct?
Yes, I was also asking what is innovative about your research.
Thank you very much for clarifying the question, esteemed opponent. So first of all, thanks a lot for the question. Thanks a lot for also for the best wishes and on my thesis and for reading it as well. So what's innovative? I think the use of some methodologies are already, let's say, already used in the literature by other authors when we talk, for instance, about indices. So to measure some complex multidimensional issues related to gender equality, to poverty, to issues that might not be focused only on one indicator, but might also take into account different areas, many scholars have used indices. So I think something that was innovative was to use this index on an area that have not yet been explored, but seems to be very relevant when we talk in terms of policy, given the landscape that is moving and the policy importance that is being given to this topic. So I think that was one thing that was innovative. The second one is that despite the fact that the two, chapter 4 and chapter 5, were more explorative, it actually makes us think of issues and areas that are not yet being assessed or addressed when we talk about trade and gender, which was, I think, the purpose also of my thesis, was to raise awareness. So to prove some things, but also to raise awareness on topics that are not yet explored, but can also have a positive and negative impact on women. So I believe that also looks into, to some extent, some kind of innovative issues. And also, I was also trying to look for the chapter 5 that was just discussed with the highly esteemed opponent as well before. I also tried to look into policies or results in the literature. So actually, I pointed out, and that's why I decided to use this theoretical framework that is not normally used on trade and development field, but is used more when we talk about organizational field or labor economics, to actually challenge and see what happens in trade then, to try to bring some also different fields of literature and research into this topic. So I think that was also something I think that was innovative, because I think when we talk about trade and gender, and especially the results from my systematic review show that there is a lot that we don't know. So I think by looking into different fields and potential methodologies that can also be applied to trade, I think that also links to something being innovative.
Thank you. Maybe we could move on and then give the floor to the next member of the opposition. That's Professor Dr. Ludovico Alcorta, who is also a member of the assessment committee and who is a professorial fellow at UNU Merit of this university. The floor goes to Professor Alcorta.
Thank you. Let me begin by congratulating. I found your thesis very interesting on two regards. First, you address one of the fundamental questions of research of our time, and perhaps of all times. And I think it's very, very interesting in that respect. And secondly, you attempted to use a multi-methodology approach. You use a bit of statistical analysis, you did interviews, tried to develop an index. So in that sense, I found it very interesting to attempt different approaches to try to address a question. And that was very interesting. Having said that, I have a few questions of perhaps of clarification, and if you could go a bit deeper into. One of the main thesis, arguments of the thesis, especially in chapter 2 and 3, is that trade and trade liberalization, while providing economic opportunities for women, may also generate or deepen gender disparities. The thesis in chapter 4 also finds that in foreign-owned agricultural operations in Cambodia, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Tanzania, there are also benefits, but also harms to women. What are the key gender disparities that arise from trade? And what are the key gender disparities that arise from agriculture? Are they the same? Are they different? And what is causing them? What lead in both sectors or altogether?
Highly esteemed opposition members, thank you very much for your questions, also for reading my thesis. So, and I think it's a very interesting question. I have not thought about that, but I think you have pointed at something that is actually making me reflect, as I also have noted out, wrote down on my paper. But it's true. So, chapter 2 looked at pathways in general. And there was a difference with chapter specifically 4 that looks into large-scale agriculture investment. First, because chapter 2 looks only at the role of women as workers, but in general. And in the chapter itself, also, when I was doing the collection of the different academic articles, I found only 84 articles, but 87%, if I'm not mistaken, look at the manufacturing sector. So there was little about the agricultural sector in itself. And only one article out of the 84 looked at the role of foreign direct investment without touching into the role of agriculture itself, so FDI, but in general, and it was a paper on China. So the pathways were to some extent similar, I will say, first from the economic perspective, in the sense that pathways, so how, and that also, if we talk at the immediate impact of trade liberalization, will be through changes in export and imports. And that will affect economic perspective for women in terms of employment, in terms of wages, in terms of working conditions, which links to labor segregation, feminization that has been also widely discussed in the literature of manufacturing industries. So that was analyzed in that chapter. While in chapter 4, I believe it was different because these women are not necessarily, let's say, cultivating crops for exporting, or are not that the nature or how these women work, or how, let's say, those contracts are being done, because, if we think about a company, exporting company that is exporting, or an importer company, it's usually a domestic company as well. But in the case of the chapter 4, we're also talking about multinational enterprises, so a company that goes from one country X to a country Y into an area that perhaps nothing existed before, a remote area. So we also find similarities in terms of employment generation. But because those areas have particularities and specificities related, for instance, to social perspective, like social inclusion of women, how women are treated in those communities, whether they have access to education, or just to a bridge to be able to cross from one city to another, I think perhaps the impact on these large-scale agricultural investments and multinationals also talks about the social perspective, which I could not find as much when I look only in general at the landscape, because it was not also provided in the 84 articles that I was reading. So I think these are, for me, the differences between the two as well. Of course, I decided to look into large-scale agricultural investment because I only found one article in the entire literature that talks about FDI, but not on a specific sector.
Can I? Yeah. Fine, and you can see that there are some differences between agriculture. Now, what is causing this? First, what is causing the disparities, and what is causing the differences, if relevant?
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opposition member. So, here I can guess what is causing the disparities between, of course, these two type of studies. So, in the case of the first one, it was that, first of all, when a country or market access is made, a trade agreement, is signed by two different parties, then removal of tariffs comes into place. So therefore, we know, and that's what literature tells us, that there will be companies that will be benefiting because of the large supply that they have in the country, so availability of resources, so they will be benefiting directly from trade, while those, for example, companies that are importing might not be benefiting because suddenly there will be a huge influx of imports into the country. So that's from the labor side. But what is causing it? As I said, trade has different components as well. So it's difficult to say what are we referring to trade? Are we referring to the trade agreement? Are we referring to an investment agreement between the country and not the country? And what that could be the one that is impacting how women are being seen? Perhaps the agreement or the exporting company might have gender-sensitive policies and the others might not, or because the host country, and perhaps it's a developed country in this case, these large-scale agricultural investment were all from developed and emerging economies, so they have, to some extent, some gender-sensitive policies that were led by the, let's say, the main headquarters. So it's slightly different as well, who define as well whether women can participate or no on those exporters, importers, and investments as well.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Mahmoud Ali El Aroui, who was also the last member of the assessment committee, and who's an associate professor of quantitative methods at the Université Internationale de Rabat. The floor goes to Dr. Mahmoud Ali El Aroui.
Thank you, Professor Sherman. First of all, I would like to congratulate Jacqueline for this excellent work. You used many methods. From the methodological point of view, the work is interesting, and you studied many aspects of the problem. I have three short questions, Jacqueline. I will give the three questions directly and let you try to answer. My first question concerns the possibility to extend your results, especially from chapter 5 to other contexts in developing economies. You know, you studied Vietnam, okay. Since the beginning, you mentioned that it's there is a high commitment in gender equality, etc. But what if we want to study South America or North Africa with different cultural, religious traditions? What remains from your chapter 5 recommendations? This is my first question. My second question concerns the separation between the manufacture and the service. What about the technological complexity of each industry within the manufacturer industries? You group telecommunications, clothing, computers, leathers, but I think that maybe you are missing some important aspects concerning the nature of the jobs, the technological complexity. Was it possible to make this distinction between sectors, and especially for the 74,000 companies? The unique reason that you chosen them, that they are traders or exporters, but are they just simple traders, intermediate between producer and customers, or among the 74,000 companies, there are those who are producers, those who are simple traders? And my last question concerns the Blau Index. You found different results concerning the relationship between gender equity using Blau Index on the net turnover and on the labor productivity. In the first case, you found the expected inverted U relationship, but for the labor productivity, you seem to find just a linear relationship. Have you an explanation concerning the difference, important difference in these two results? And for the Blau Index, if you have a low Blau Index, meaning that there is a small gender equity, have you an idea, or did you compare the performances among those who have a low Blau Index because there is a high female rate, and the companies which have a low Blau Index because they have a high male rate? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the questions, and also for helping me to challenge me as well on those questions, referring to chapter 5. So perhaps I will try to start with the last one, and then, of course, just let me know if I have not covered all the remaining questions. So the Blau Index and the female chair. So first of all, these two, why I use those two is because they try to explain two different issues. So the Blau Index is a metric of diversity. It ranges from 0 to 5. So 0.5 will mean that there is an equal number of, in this case, male and female workers. But when we look into the female share, of course, it only refers to women. So, for example, if we have an increase in the female share from 20 to 40 and 70 to 90, will not mean that there is diversity in the workforce. So these two measures, to some extent, complement each other. So in terms of the selection of the different industries, manufacturing and services industries. Indeed, I think that was, you have made a very interesting point that I could have further disaggregated those industries, since I have also the information regarding those industries. I decided to keep it as an aggregated level because I found these, as also was mentioned before, as a first step of analysis to try to understand what this relationship tells us. Moving forward, I think it will be interesting to, of course, disaggregate those industries. And in the case of manufacturing, there were plenty of industries to use as well. As you said, of course, we can argue they are not the same. They are quite different across manufacturing and services as well. Telecommunications and tourism, of course, we can see some differences among them. So concerning whether I know whether they're producers as well, I only have the information concerning products that are traded by them. So I know what they're exporters or importers, but I don't know more information than that. I don't have the information to be able to know what they produce specifically, whether they're producers, or suppliers, or what kind of what is their position within the value chain for each specific company. So regarding the possible extension, I think that's key. And actually, this was also part of the recommendations that I have put in for chapter 5, was to extend the research. What I will need, and I think that's the ideal question, if we will have more this gender disaggregated data, we of course can do much more of this research. Something else that we need, for example, and maybe reflecting on that, is when we talk about labor statistics and the labor statistics that are generally collected, we only look at the information, or the information is collected usually by occupation. So we have information by occupation, but we don't have information by gender. Or we have information by gender, but it's not disaggregated by industry. So I think nowadays, and from the time that I started to work on my thesis, there are countries that have started to work on compiling microdata and linking this data. So labor statistics with administrative data, with registries, for example, to be able to say much more about gender. So moving forward, we will have that information, though. And one of the issues that, of course, my thesis wanted to address, and it's also on the name, is I wanted to focus on developing countries. But the countries that are making these big milestones are Canada, are Georgia, and are Finland, which actually are working, and collecting this data, microlinking this data requires a huge investment. So now we have some models to follow, and I think moving forward, this is what I think will be critical to be able to extend this research to other countries, and of course include as well more data on non-exporters, for example, to avoid any more omissions of information or potential variables. Look for better instruments as well, and of course include or expand this data set. But I think nowadays this data is becoming available, so actually it will be possible to extend this research to other regions, though not yet in that developing in developing countries, but I think we are moving, at least this information starting to become available. I hope I answered all your questions.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Franziska Gassmann, who is a professor of social protection and development at this university. And the floor goes to Professor Gassmann.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, let me also congratulate to your thesis, which I read with great interest. So thank you. Doing something, research on gender equality. I was particularly drawn to and intrigued by your chapter 3, where you ask how trade and trade-related policies, laws, and service delivery can be assessed in terms of their gender responsiveness. For that purpose, you develop a composite index which would allow you to measure the outcomes. You also criticize existing indices for not measuring government's progress in key policy areas towards women economic empowerment in trade. Now, the selection of your indicators was guided, as you write, by their relevance to the government policy process and factors enabling women's economic empowerment in trade. It includes input, output, outcome, impact indicators. It considers areas that determine women's empowerment, such as access to resources, agency and achievements. It also includes macro level and policy indicators. In the end, you have selected or identified 83 indicators. And you put that together into one composite index. Now, this has sparked a lot of questions on my end, which I would like to challenge you a little bit, because, you know, and then I look, you measure it, you collect the data, and you present the results, and in the end, you find very little variation between the countries. If I look at table 11, I think it was. And I wonder, what are you measuring in the end? What is the analytical power of your index? And just to elaborate, because in your, I think in an earlier answer, you also you referred to other composite indices, for example, in poverty, and yes, I agree, we do that too. And if I think about the multidimensional poverty index, which is really widely established right now, has 10 indicators. And already that sparked a lot of criticism in the field, you know, saying, you know, so now we have, previously we measured, let's say, poverty with a monetary measure, let's say, having enough income. It was very clear. Now we have 10 indicators, they are put together. We don't know anymore what we are measuring, because it is, Martin Ravalian would say, it is a mashup of indices. So that sparked the question about the analytical usefulness to some extent. And then I wondered, you know, so you included both micro and macro level indicators, and could you make an argument, let's say, to focus just on women's outcomes at the micro level, for example, because it is all about gender equality? And would that not be a much more powerful for the analysis and the identification of policy barriers in the end? That's my first question.
Hi, esteemed opponent. Thank you very much for reading my thesis as well, and also for your insightful question, and for challenging me as well on that. So maybe I fully agree with you that indices are really very criticized in the literature. There are several of them, and even in gender equality, when we talk about gender equality, there are several of them. So I think there was, a composite index, and maybe just go to the COMSES as well here. What I developed was a scoreboard index. And I used two methodologies to analyze them. So the one was a composite indicator, which is what everyone uses and aggregates everything into a single number. But there was a lot of power into looking at each one of the 6 policy dimensions. So that's why I didn't call it a trend gender index, but call it a scoreboard index, to be able really to highlight that there is a lot of information in each one of these 6 policy dimensions. So why I didn't look only at the outcome and just look into, first of all, because the policy cycle was very important. So I'm looking at the role of institutions. And it was very important to look at the process, since this is still a new topic. So there is still definitions that are not made in this field. So I wanted to know first if the information was collected, so how they work, these institutions, to what extent they say they are gender-sensitive institutions. So that's why it links both, so the outcome and the process, what I call the process indicators in my thesis, and also the outcome indicators, to be able to see whether both are going hand by hand. So there was the reasoning why I have selected both indicators. As I pointed out, there were definitions. Institutions didn't have any definitions of why this was being done. So I think that was also important to look at the policy, but also at the capacity of government officials, because if at the end it's the governments who will need to put in place those policies, that was also part of the indicators, whether they have the capacity, the knowledge to be able to put in place those kind of policies. Even if they design the policy, okay, are they ready to put the policy?
Let me follow up immediately with capacity, because you identified the 83 indicators, but essentially the data available, you only had, let's say, you found data only for 20 of these 83 indicators. And so you had to start collecting the data, a rather tedious process. I think it's very interesting that you did that. But I think a little bit beyond, essentially what you would like, I guess that is what you want, that this indicator is established eventually and it will be used, that we measure over time and we will be able to see progress. But I would also argue it is a very costly way to collect this information. Now you did it for, I don't remember, 20 countries or something like that, where you tried it out. So obviously you would like to have this globally. So it's costly to collect this data, again, which for me then raises the question how useful it is. Will actually governments and institutions pick this up, knowing how, what they will have to do in order to collect the data? How do you see that? And it may be also going back, let's say, I know you have done that, right? If you would start again, would you do it the same way, or what would you change? With respect, not with your entire thesis, really with these indicators.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this very interesting, challenging question, I would say. It's not only costly, I would say, I fully agree with you, and it's not only costly, but also relies a lot on political will, which is one of perhaps the most challenging parts when you develop an index for policymakers. The index have actually, since it was launched by my organization in the UN, has been now covered 50 countries. So it has been already replicated to 50 countries. And what was interesting is that helped to develop policy recommendations, which were not there before. So there was some usefulness in collecting all this data, and there was a lot of political will from countries to do it, to actually go through this process. In terms of how demanding it was, I would say it was not too demanding, because there was the first step was to do a mapping of all the different institutions, which was about 20 institutions in each country, and it was through a national consultant that this information was collected. Qualitative information and quantitative information. And not only that, but also because it was have a policy relevant, it was the results are all displayed in our online website as well. Currently, so any government can also identify good practices through this data collection. So I think there was a lot of political will, and there is, as I said, there is a lot of people who would like to know how I can develop those policies. So I think perhaps in some contexts where we have a lot of information and a lot of evidence, perhaps it's better just to have few indicators. But in this case, and I fully agree with you, if I would have done it in a different way, perhaps I would have just looked at the process, not at the outcomes. Because I think if we said the process is what guides the outcomes, then probably I would have just only looked at the process in itself, or an institution's perspective, so the policy recommendations will go on that way. But sometimes government want to know what will be the outcome. And that's why it had to be included at that moment. But perhaps moving forward, if I will have to redo it, I will have just look at the process, which will have reduced around 20 indicators.
Thank you.
Which means that thank you very much, that we've concluding the first round, and I'm happy to introduce the second round. And I'm looking at Professor Sanders, whether he would have a question in this second round, which can only be a short one, and also you will be most probably limited a bit in responding to it.
Given the time, but during the discussion that we've seen here, another question came up to me, reflecting a little bit as an outsider on the debate on gender and gender issues in general, and then specifically in gender and trade. I guess there is underneath that whole discussion a sense of injustice that drives a lot of the motivation for studying this, and I buy it. I believe that there is indeed reasons that women are disadvantaged in general, and you show that in trade it's also the case. But I was wondering, when reading your thesis and also hearing the discussion, if trade liberalization is not to the full advantage of women, would protectionism be to the advantage of women? Or would we, if we study that with the same rigor that you've studied trade liberalization in this thesis, would we come to the conclusion that also protection would hurt the position of women in their economic freedoms? And if that was the conclusion, where does that leave us? Would we not also find the same conclusions if we did this for men? I just really have an open question there, and I would like you use 1 minute to reflect on that.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this question. Putting my hat as a UN official, I also get this question by policymakers quite a lot. So, protectionism versus trade liberalization. And I think one of the instruments, what we have seen that some gender equality provisions have been included is trade agreements. And currently there is a lot of discussion on whether these provisions should be binding or not. Binding a provision means adding protectionism. So meaning that if you do not provide gender equality and you have an agreement with another country, therefore you are restricted to enter into that particular country. And just maybe I would like also to say like we see that more and more countries are adding some kind of protection measures because of public morals. So we see that happening. For example,
feel free to briefly conclude.
Thank you. So 2 weeks ago, the EU have decided to put a ban on companies that importing products that have been done with labor force. So actually this, if we think about that, if that can be applied also to gender equality, so to some extent it will become a kind of a tariff or measure or barrier, but I think we are moving into that space as well. And I think moving forward, it will be an interesting topic to continue to research.
Thank you. Jacqueline Rosemary Salguero Huaman, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. And the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Jacqueline Rosemary Salguero Huaman, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Ramani is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Thank you. Should I take this? Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
That's good. So, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Jacqueline, Rosemary, Salguero Huaman, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree, certificate, I'll just open it after this, signed by the rector, the secretary, and other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Your laudatio will also be done by Professor Ramani.
Thank you, Prorector. So, Jacqueline, as you know, the PhD process is a long journey of partnership, right? Between the doctoral student and the supervisor. Now, in game theory, for a good collaboration, there are two things that are necessary to be kept in mind: partner selection and contract design. Now, rationality dictates that both these be observed so as to generate the maximum benefits for both parties. But as you know, we now have enough evidence that not all of us are very rational. Certainly I'm not. So, what do I look for a student, in a student? Well, 4 years or 5 years is a long time, right? So besides being the student being intelligent and having an interesting topic, one would want some kind of fun, entertainment, an intellectual journey to learn about other things. I want to learn from my student also. Otherwise, it would be a drag. And you have fulfilled all these conditions. And for contract design, of course, tolerance with my informality and being late for all Zoom appointments. So you've been very kind to me. So the thing is, you see, I also like people who have a little do-gooder DNA. There are many things you don't know about her. Today I'm going to reveal everything. So this one is a real Amazonian, okay? She represented Peru in Taekwondo for 12 years, or over 13 years, 12, 13 years. And when she was working with a multinational there, trying to help indigenous communities, and she found out that the multinational was also trying to grab some land of the indigenous people, she dumped them. That takes a lot of courage. And then, you see, I run an NGO. I usually invite people, I mean, I talk about myself and what I'm doing, but she just joined naturally. And she's the one who convinced me about the role of community engagement in climate disasters. And we have talked a lot about climate disasters which are repeating. And she's told me a lot and written about the El Nino in Peru and what is there to learn about it. She taught other Finn interns. So she's been very active, and I've learned a lot. But the most interesting story, now for the econometricians, I am very sure it's not causal. Might be, I don't know. So, due to a lot of chance events, 10 years back, she came to Geneva. And in a Christmas party, Nandita, would you please stand up? Nandita's neighbor asked Jacqueline to dance the salsa with her. And now today, you see, he not only formatted the dissertation, he is also a paranym. A big hand to a fabulous husband also, and her brothers. But this was not without its challenges, It's not easy for a person who is telling policymakers what to do, how to use data, which data to use, to have to face up to supervisors and say, this paragraph, you have to rewrite it again, my dear. This will not do. What is the logical argumentation in this? I don't know. Is this the best way to do it? I mean, it is very difficult to switch between that stream, these two streams, and sometimes, even though Jacqueline is a fierce fighter and a strong Amazonian woman, she had her self-doubts. But having self-doubts is not a bad thing. It's what makes us humble. So we used to chat, and she just got over them, did what had to be done, and is here today, successful. And I'm sure she will sail through for the rest of her life with the same confidence as she showed today at the Defense, teaching and helping communities, and also going back to Peru every year to help the indigenous communities and also teach there. So, Jacqueline, thank you for everything you've done, okay? And wish you the very best.
Professor Ramani, thank you for a wonderful and encouraging laudatio. Dear Dr. Salguero Huaman, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family and your friends with the degree you have acquired. I would like to thank the members of the degree committee, both here on site and those online, for their contribution to this session. And allow us that immediately after I close this session that I give an opportunity to the members of the degree committee who are online to congratulate you shortly, because, well, you'll be the first to understand and be happy with this, and also for them that's an opportunity to be with you. I conclude this session and give the floor to the online members of the degree committee. Please go ahead. Let's start with Dr. Judith Fesai.
Thank you. Well, congratulations, Jacqueline. This is an impressive achievement. It's a very important topic that you are to this topic in your daily job. It's particularly impressive because I know you have 12 hours a day job at the ITC. So well done.
Thank you. And now give the floor to Dr. Mohamed Ali El-Aroui.
Congratulations, Jacqueline. Good luck for your career. And you already got the chance to work with very good supervisors, so continue.
Thank you. Of course, our congratulations also go to Dr. Neil Foster McGregor, because he was the supervisor next to Professor Ramani. Thank you, Neil. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. And congratulations, Jacqueline, also for an interesting and fun defence. I thought that was very nice. That hour was passed by very quickly. So congratulations on the defence and on the thesis. And good luck in your next steps. And obviously, I hope you enjoy this evening. I hope you're going to go out in Maastricht and enjoy some time together with family and friends. Have a good celebration. Congratulations.
Thank you, Neil. So once again, I now definitely close this session, and you can go and celebrate.
Thank you very much.